Hello, everybody, and welcome to CCCS 111 Introduction to Programming. In today's lecture, we're going to cover an important concept which is called the while iteration statement. The while statement comes in very handy when you actually have to repeat some statements, and turns out that this is something that you have to do very frequently. So let's look at an example. If you look at this pseudocode statement, um, one scenario where you might need to repeat something is, let's say you're out shopping and you are filling up your cart. So you could keep repeating or adding elements to your cart or items to your cart until you have crossed off all the items on your shopping list. Now, this could be written as a pseudo code statement, which is while there are more items on my shopping list, purchase next item and cross it off my list. So this is something that contains repetition. So you purchase an item, then you cross it off your list, then you purchased the next item on your list, and then you cross it off your list. So this is something that you're repeating. So let's look at how a while statement works, and it generally works when by using what is called a while statement. So it checks whether a statement is true, and if it is true, it repeats the statements in the body of the while statement. And as soon as the statement, or so as soon as the condition of the while statement becomes false, then it stops the repetition and goes to the next statement in the program. So let's look at an example quickly. uh, so here is an example of a while statement, and with most statements that you have seen, just like with most statements that you have seen so far, a while statement consists of a condition. So this is your condition. You start with the while keyword and then you check a certain condition, and then you have the body of your while statement. And generally what you tend to do is, as long as this statement is true, you will keep repeating the statements inside the body. So you start from here, you go into the while statement go into the while statement, go into its body, execute this statement, and then come back here and check if this condition is still true. If it is still true, you're going to repeat the statements in the body, and you're going to keep doing this until the time that uh, the condition becomes false. And when the condition becomes false, you then move to the next line after that follows the body of the statement. So you will come down here somewhere. Sorry for cramming up the slide, I don't have too much space to write. Let me just erase all the ink. Okay, so let's now look at the statements of this particular while condition and see what we are trying to accomplish here. So what we're trying to accomplish here is to find the first power of 3 that becomes larger than 100. So we start off with a value of 3 that is assigned to this integer variable product. We go in to the while statement, we check the condition. Is the value of product less than equal to 100? It is. We go in, we take the value of product and multiply it by 3. So on the first iteration, we will get 3 times 3, which is equal to 9. And then we will come back here and then we will check, is 9 less than equal to 100? And it is. We will come down again, we will again multiply the value of product by 3. So we'll have 9 times 3, and we will then keep repeating this process of multiplication by 3 until we get to a value which is actually greater than 100. So let's look at this on the flow chart. So this is our condition. So our condition, so as soon as we go into the while loop, the first thing that is done is to check whether product is less than or equal to 100. So the first value is 3, it's less than 100. So we go into the loop, we multiply 3 by 3, we get a value over here which is 9. We come back here, we check, well, is 9 less than 100? And it is. So we come back here, we multiply 9 by 3, which is 27, and then we come here and we check, is 27 less than 100, which it is. And then we again multiplied that by 3 to get 81. Now is 81 less than 100? It is. So come back here for the third time, and then we multiply 81 by 3, which I believe is 243. And then we come here and we check, well, is 243 less than 100? Well, actually less than or equal to 100? Well, no, it's not. So then we come down here and we go to whatever statement we have after the body of the if statement. So we come down here. Okay. So this slide basically just explains what I just explained. So we will stop when the value of product becomes equal to 243. Okay, now let's take another example, and in this example what we want to do is say we want to compute the average of a class of 10 students that took a quiz, right? And the grades that each student can obtain are integer values between 0 to 100, and so we want to determine the class average on the quiz. So what we will have to do in this case is we will have to add up all the values of the grades that we have. So we add every student's grade, we get one number, and then we divide that by the total number of grades that we have, or rather the number of students that we have, which in this case is 10. So we will take the overall sum or the total and we will divide that by 10, and that will give us the average. Now this is something where if you think about it, we have to do repetition, right? If we break this down, because how are we working? So we add grade 1 or grade of student 1, and then we add to it the grade of the next student, which could be student 2, and then we add to it the grade of the next student. And so this is something which you can accomplish by repetition. So you can use the while loop to do this. Let me give you an example of how you could do this, because yes, the simplest way of doing this is something like grade 1 plus grade 2. You keep going until you get to grade 10. But the problem with this is that um, it will require too many variables and become very long after a little bit of time. So if you want to avoid that, you can actually do this concisely uh, or much more smartly using the while statement. So let's see how that can be accomplished. Well, you can do this by something which is called a counter controlled iteration uh, to input the grade. So you can ask the user to input grades one at a time, and then you keep accumulating or keep adding the values that the user has entered. So you ask the user to enter 10 values one by one, and you keep adding those values to each other. So you could define a variable which could be integer, and its initial value could be 0. And then what you could do is go and ask the user to enter the first value of grade, and then add sum to the first value of the grade that the user enters. So now your sum is 0 plus grade 1. Then you go ahead and repeat this, and in the next iteration you ask the user to enter grade 2. And so what this will keep doing, if you keep repeating this and you do it 10 times, what you will have is a variable sum which will contain the accumulated sum of all 10 grades that the user entered one by one. And then when you get to 10, you need to have a variable which counts the number of entries that the user made. So once you get to 10, once the counter actually reaches 10, then you stop, and at that time the variable sum will actually be the sum of all 10 grades entered by the user. So let's go ahead and see how this can be done. Let's look at the pseudocode of this. So we start with uh, set total to 0. So instead of sum, over here we are using a variable total which we are setting initially to 0. Then we have another variable counter which we set to 1. So we ask the user, so we're starting off with the value of 1 by default. And then what we do is we go and use a while statement, and we say while grade counter is less than or equal to 10, input the next grade. So the first time you come here, your counter will be 1. So your while condition will be satisfied. You will input the first grade. You will add the grade into the total. So you will have total per first grade. Then you will increase the value of the counter by 1. So the counter becomes 2. Then you will go back up and you will check, is 2 less than 10 or less than or equal to 10? Yes. Then you will ask the user to input next grade. You will add that to the total, and then you will increase your counter again, and you will keep repeating this until the value of counter becomes greater than 10. So when it becomes 11, then you stop taking more values, and then total will basically contain sum of all grades, all 10 grades entered by the user. And then obviously, in order to compute the average, what you will need to do is you will need to divide this sum of all grades by 10. And then once you do that, that will be your total. That will be your average, sorry. So let's look at this. Uh, we are using an unsigned integer for counter, which makes sense because counter can never be negative. So it's wise to actually, or it's pretty smart to use an unsigned integer for counter. We're using an integer for grade. Uh, you could also use an unsigned integer for this as well, but it doesn't matter. Then you use an integer for total, an integer for average. So you initialize all your variables. Now, two of these variables needs to have some sort of initial values. Total needs to start off with 0, counter needs to start off with 1. Then you go ahead and you add your while statement, and you put the condition while counter is less than equal to 10. So what that means is, if you're incrementing the counter by 1 every time, this loop will repeat 10 times. Every time you ask the user to input, and you add the grade that the user enters. So the grade is entered by using the scanf statement, and then the value entered to the grade is added to the total. Counter is incremented, and you keep repeating this until counter becomes greater than 10. That's when you stop. And then finally your average is total divided by 10. So you can see in this case, your sample run, um, the user actually entered 10 values, and the average value that you got was 81. One thing that you want to note is that the average is actually 81.7, not exactly 81, but because we assign the average to be an integer data type, that's why we get an integer value. Now, how can we actually get decimal values? Where you can use floating point numbers, and that's what we will do in the next example, when we actually make this current example a bit more intelligent. So let's go ahead and see how we can do that. So just a couple more things that I want to say about this. You have to initialize the variables sum and counter to 0 and 1, because if you do not, then you will get garbage values inside these variables, and you don't want to start off this way. So you don't want random values going into your variables. If you know a variable, sum should initially contain nothing, so you should initialize it to 0, and you want the counter to start with 1, so you should explicitly set it to 1, because if you do not, it might get some random value like maybe 180 80 something, or some might be something else, and that will cause you problems in calculation. So remember to initialize them. It's very important to do that. um, and then we said that yes, actual average is 81.7, and in order to get that value, we will or deal in order to be able to display floating point values, we will need to use floating types of variables. So let's go ahead and modify our current example. A couple of things that we need to do is, the class size does not always have to be 10. So we need to increase the class size to be anything. It could be 10, it could be 11, it could be 30, it could be 200. And so we need to change this. Now the problem is, some of you may ask, well, how will we stop? And that's the basic question that we need to ask. How are we going to stop? And I'll tell you how to do that in a second. Um, but one thing that I do want to tell you is, for while loops, whenever you use a while statement, you generally do not know exactly how many repetitions you will have to do, and the stopping point will often come inside, or will be determined during the program. So if you are in a condition where you know that you will have to repeat some statements multiple times, but you do not know exactly how many times you will have to repeat them, then you should be using while statements. Okay. So how do we get the program to actually stop when at a certain point, or maybe we want the program to say maybe compute stop after 10 repetitions at one time, and maybe stop after 20 repetitions or 21 repetitions at another time, or maybe 15 repetitions at another time that it is run. So if the class size is 15, we wanted to repeat 15 times. So how do we do that? So let's go ahead and see how that is done. Now, this is often accomplished using a variable whose value is used to terminate the while condition. So, these values or variables are often determined or often called sentinel variables, or the value that terminates the while statement is called the sentinel value. Now, what is a sentinel value? So, a sentinel variable is a variable which is used as the condition of the while statement. So, um, within the while statement, you apply the condition sentinel on the sentinel variable. So your condition is basically controlled by the sentinel value, right? This is also called a signal value or a dummy value or a flag value. Now, out of these two terms, the most frequently used ones are the flag value or the sentinel value. The sentinel value is a value which, when the loop sees, it terminates. So you could have this condition where you say that while, let's say, the sentinel variable, so let's say we call this s, um, when this sentinel variable is equal to 0, or let's say is not equal to 0, your condition is satisfied. And when this sentinel value becomes equal to 0, that's when your um, loop terminates. So we can use this to control when our program terminates. So when we want the program to terminate, we can set the sentinel value to whatever value we want it to be. So let's say if the sentinel value is 0, we're going to terminate the program at 0. Okay. So so in this case, we're going to be using a sentinel value of -1. So as long as our sentinel value is not -1, our loop will keep repeating, and when it becomes -1, our loop will, or sorry, our while statement will terminate. Okay. So, you could think of this as, you could ask the user to enter -1 when they have finished entering the grade. So let's say you have a class of 5 students. So you could ask the user to enter these values. So the user comes in and enters 5 values, and then once he's added all 5 values, the user can enter -1, and the -1 is the sentinel value, and so it will terminate our program. So let's go ahead and look at that. Now, before we do that, we further need to um, refine our program, right? In the sense that we need to generalize it to determine the class average. So the first thing that we want to do is to kind of take a large statement and then break it down into smaller smaller statements. So we use our top down stepwise refinement. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to determine the class average for the quiz, right? Now this conveys just one meaning of what the program is supposed to do, but it doesn't tell you exactly how it's going to accomplish this. So let's break it down further. So how do we want to compute, or how are we going to evaluate the class average? Well, we just saw that the first thing that you need to do is you need to initialize variables. So you need to take variables input, sum and count, and the quiz grades. Um, so you need to input three variables. In fact, sum, um, sorry, so you need to input variables. You need to input or initialize variables. So you need to initialize sum to 0, you need to initialize count to maybe 1, and then you need to input the quiz grades, and then you need to accumulate these values. You need to calculate and print the class average. How do we do that? Let's see if we break it down further. um, so in the second refinement, we could uh, um, write this as okay. The pseudocode statement first is initialize the variables. You can actually break this down further, right, to two statements: initialize total to 0, initialize counter to 0, um, and then the pseudocode statement which says input sum and count the quiz grades. How do we actually break this down? Well, this requires a bit more attention. We need to first input the first grade, and then we need to put the accumulation or the summing inside the body of a while statement. So we say that while the user has not entered the sentinel, so while the user has not entered the value which is going to terminate the while condition, while that has not happened, we add the grade that we receive into the running total. So we add, to execute this statement, we take sum, and to sum we add the grade that the user has input. And we, so once we do that, we ask the user to input the next grade. Now if the user sets grade equal to something that is, any number between 0 and 100, so it could be, let's say, 80, we will go back and we will repeat this statement. However, if the user enters something like -1, which is the sentinel value, if that happens, so while the user has not yet entered the sentinel, so if the user enters the sentinel, then we stop and we move to the next statement. Okay. Uh, One more thing, with pseudocode, you generally do not use braces as you would with a normal um, while statement. With this, what you do is you just indent the value. So you increase the spacing somewhat. And what that means is all these three statements are inside the body of the while statement. So just remember this. All right, and then finally, one more thing that we need to ensure. It is possible that the very first value that the user enters is the sentinel value. So, if the first time you ask the user to enter a grade and the user enters -1, then that means that he does not want to enter any value, um, and you want the program to terminate, and you don't want it you don't want it computing any values. So 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 if no value is entered, then your counter is going to be 0, right? Because in this case we're using a counter value of initial value is 0, um, and not 1. So if you divide by 0, you are going to get an infinite value, so you don't want to do that. So at the end we also add this one condition. So if the counter is not equal to 0, then you compute the average. However, if no grades were entered, so if the counter is 0, then you just print no grades were entered, and that's how you stop, right? So let's look at the pseudocode all together. So initialize total to 0, initialize counter to 0 as well. This is different from last time where we were initializing the counter to 1. And why are we initializing it to 0 instead of 1? Because the first grade that that we enter we go into uh, before we go into the while statement, right? So input first grade. Now if this first grade is -1, meaning that the user does not want to enter any value, then we don't go into the while statement. We just come down here counter should not be equal to 0. If the counter is 0, we just print no grades were entered. However, if sentinel value is not entered, we go into the while loop, we add or compute the running total. Then once the user enters -1, then we stop taking values, we come down here, and once we come down here, after adding a few values, the counter should not be equal to 0. And then when it's not equal to 0, we compute the average by dividing the total by um, uh, the value of the counter, and then we print the average. So let's go ahead and look at that. Let's look at the code. Right, so we start with unsigned integer counter. We declare the variables for grade and total. Because the average can be decimal numbers, we use a floating point data type. We initialize total and counter to 0. This is the part where we ask the user to input or enter the first grade. We ask them to enter -1 if they do not want to compute an average. Or so in the while loop, what we do is we basically use this sentinel value. So we apply the check on the sentinel value. So as long as grade is not equal to -1, right, we keep asking the user, or we keep executing these statements inside the body of the while loop, which basically asks the user to enter uh, grades one by one. So first time we ask the user to enter. So once we go into the loop, we increase counter by 1, and kind of keep repeating it until we get to a condition where uh, the sentinel value is observed, and then we compute the average. If no grades are entered, we just print no grades were entered. Now, one more thing that is very important in this program is that notice that there is this parentheses float in front of the uh, total variable on this line 38. Now, why is this? Well, because if you notice above over here, we declared the total to be an integer. And so if we divide an integer by an integer, we will lose the decimal values. So the values after the decimal will be discarded. And even though this is a float, this will show up as something like, if this was 81.7, it will show up as 81.00 something. Now, so in order to do that, in order to actually correctly observe the floating point value, what you need to do is you need to convert this integer variable into a floating point number or a floating point variable, and you can do that by putting this parentheses and float before the name of the variable. And so what this will do is it will convert this into a floating point number, and then the result that you will see is also going to be a correct floating point number, so it will show you the correct value. So you can see that here, actually get a value of 82.5 when these grades are entered. Now, one more thing that I want to kind of tell you is what you're doing here is something which is called casting. So you are basically converting an integer value to a floating point value, or an integer variable into a floating or a decimal variable. Now you can do this by adding this statement before the place where you actually use the integer variable in your calculation. Now this type of conversion is called an explicit conversion. So you're explicitly converting this variable, which originally is an integer, into a floating point number for this particular calculation. So explicitly convert an integer into a floating point number, but there's something else going on as well. Since this number is an integer, uh, and C language typically does not do calculations between data types that are different from each other, uh, so the compiler will also convert the counter variable into an integer, into a float as well for the time being. So what will happen is it will do this implicit conversion. So even though you're not asking the compiler to convert this variable into an integer, because C language will not do or cannot do this type of operation, it will automatically convert the denominator variable into a floating point number as well. So both of these will be converted into floats, and then it will give you a result in a floating point number as well. So this is something that you need to remember as well, and it's quite important.